Just off the coast of Australia, divers uncover a skeleton buried in sand, the hands bound and a rusted blade placed beside the bones. Nearby, another discovery is made. A shipwreck beneath the waves, its remains untouched for nearly 400 years. There were no reports of pirates, no records of battle, and yet something happened here. Something so dark that even the sea couldn't erase it. To understand, we have to go back to 1628, to the doomed voyage of the Batavia, a ship of the Dutch East India Trading Company, where horrifying atrocities would occur as its men and women battled for survival. This story is intense, so much so that we're still talking about it nearly half a millennium later. Let's move on. So to understand this voyage and what happened, we have to circle around back to 1628. The Batavia set sail from the Netherlands, embarking on a months-long voyage to the Dutch East Indies, which is now modern-day Indonesia. The Batavia was a flagship of the Dutch East India Company. It was much more than just a standard merchant vessel. It was a floating fortress of wealth and power. The ship carried more than 330 people, including sailors, soldiers, merchants, women, and children. It was loaded with tons of silver coins, fine textiles, trade goods, and weapons, all destined for the colony of Batavia, now called Jakarta, where the Dutch East India Company sought to expand their empire in the lucrative spice trade. But on board, things weren't just about to get spicy. The real battle wasn't between nations. It was going to be between the men themselves. The ship's captain, Arjen Jacobs, was an experienced but volatile sailor. He was known for his harsh discipline and reckless decisions. His second in command, Jeronimus Cornelisz, was an outsider in every sense, a failed apothecary who had fled to Netherlands under suspicions of heresy. Unlike soldiers and sailors aboard, Cornelisz wasn't a warrior, but an ideologue, and his beliefs would prove far deadlier than any cannon. As the voyage stretched on, tension simmered beneath the surface. Jacobs and Cornelisz had little respect for each other. The captain was a man of the sea. Cornelisz was a man of dangerous ideas. The two were on a collision course, one that neither would walk away from unscathed. But whispers of something even darker began spreading among the crew. Cornelisz, charismatic and persuasive, had begun gathering followers very quietly. Rumors would swirl. Was he planning a mutiny? Had he already planted the seeds of rebellion? But before any plan could take shape, fate would intervene. Months into the voyage, a miscalculation in navigation would soon turn a brewing conspiracy into something far worse. The Batavia was headed for disaster. For 7 months, the Batavia had survived the open ocean. But on the night of June 4, 1629, everything changed. Captain Jacobs, believing they were still far from land, had taken a southern route, sailing through the treacherous waters in search of faster winds. He was dead wrong, and in the night, with no warning, the ship slammed into an uncharted coral reef off the coast of what is now Western Australia. The impact was catastrophic. The wood groaned and splintered as the hull tore open. Water rushed in, flooding the lower decks, dragging supplies and passengers into the abyss. Panic erupted. Orders were shouted, but in the darkness, confusion reigned. Soldiers, sailors, women, and children screamed as the ship listed violently, the ocean swallowing it piece by piece. For hours, survivors clung to the wreckage, waiting for daylight to reveal their fate. When the sun finally rose, they saw a scattering of low-lying islands in the distance. With no lifeboats prepared, the strongest among them swam for shore, using barrels and broken beams to stay afloat. Many never made it. It's thought that up to 40 people died during the initial collision. Around 268 survivors would reach what is called Beacon Island, a name that promised safety but offered none. It was a barren strip of land with no fresh water, no food, and no shelter from the relentless sun. The shipwreck were already starving, exhausted, and desperate. Now they faced a new kind of horror: survival in unforgiving wilderness. Realizing the situation was hopeless, a person named Commander Francisco Pelser made a fateful decision. Pelser was what was called an upper merchant, which was a senior administrative person on the ship. However, he had no command and control over things like navigation. That would be deferred to the captain of the ship. So Pelser, at this point, makes the decision that he and a handful of men would take a seaworthy boat, one of the only lifeboats that was still afloat, and set sail for the city of Batavia over 1,500 miles away, with the promise of returning with help. With Pelser gone, the survivors split into factions almost immediately, but this wasn't a natural divide. It was part of Cornelisz's growing strategy. Among the survivors was a group of Dutch East India Company men and soldiers, including a person named Wiebbe Hayes. These men were trained in combat, and they posed a threat to Cornelisz's growing power. Cornelisz knew that as long as they were on Beacon Island, these men could challenge him, so he devised a plan. Cornelisz ordered that the soldiers leave, claiming they needed to scout nearby islands for food and water, using makeshift rafts and salvage debris from the wreck. They were ferried across the water in small groups, but when they arrived, they immediately realized they had been deceived. These islands were barren, with no food, no fresh water, and no shelter. And once dropped off by Cornelisz and his men, they had no way to return, as he kept the rafts. What was supposed to be a survival mission was actually an exile. With the strongest and most disciplined men stranded elsewhere, Cornelisz tightened his grip on the remaining survivors. He was now in control of both food and water left on Beacon Island and all of the people who remained, who were weak, desperate, and easy to manipulate. The sun-baked survivors watched the horizon, waiting for help. Day after day, and no ships came. No help arrived, and slowly they began to understand the truth. They were completely and utterly alone. As the weeks drug on, the survivors began to fade into desperation. The sun was unrelenting, burning their skin by day, while the nights offered little relief. Food supplies dwindled quickly, reduced to a few scraps of rations that were either infested with insects or completely rotten. The barrenness of the island became abundantly clear. There were no fruit-bearing plants, no fresh water, and zero shelter. Some would try drinking seawater, only speeding up their descent into delirium, making them even more dehydrated. Others resorted to licking the morning dew off rocks, a mere attempt to stay hydrated that would prove to be almost useless. Thirst and starvation began taking, and the bodies of the survivors started to fail before people's minds did. But what would happen next is far worse than anything the ocean could have thrown at them. Jeronimus Cornelisz saw his opportunity. With Pelser gone, with Wiebbe Hayes and his crew gone, the survivors had no clear leadership. Captain Jacobs had lost the trust of the people, and now Cornelisz, realizing that Captain Jacobs had lost the trust of the people, and without the strict command of a military officer, the group began splitting further and further into factions. Cornelisz, who had already begun whispering to his followers during the voyage, positioned himself as the only man who could bring order. I mean, he controlled the food and water after all. The weak and the desperate had no choice but to obey him. At first it was quiet. Survivors who challenged his authority just simply disappeared. A man caught stealing water, gone by morning. The sick and injured, pushed into the sea under the cover of darkness. Then it would become organized. Cornelisz declared that there weren't enough supplies for everyone, and if they were going to survive until Pelser returned, they would need to thin the numbers. Slowly, his followers became executioners. The elderly, the wounded, the sick, they were all dragged away and drowned, or strangled, or left to starve on separate islands. Those who resisted met the same fate. There's a historical account of Cornelisz actually leading a group of women and children in a lifeboat out to sea, tied up and throwing them overboard one by one. When he returned back to the rest of the survivors, he simply informed them that they had went on to another island, leaving them to believe that they were still alive and well when he had just murdered the entire crew of them. As I mentioned earlier, to remove the threat of anyone fighting back against them, Cornelisz had already manipulated a group of soldiers into essentially being exiled to another island where there was no food or water. It was a death sentence, stranded with nothing. They were meant to perish, but unbelievably, they wouldn't. And unbeknownst to Cornelisz, those soldiers that he abandoned would become his greatest threat. If you're enjoying this episode or these epic survival stories and historical mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing with somebody you know. It really helps us grow, and I won't take any more of your time, so please like this video if you like it. Otherwise, we're moving on. Among the exiled men was Wiebbe Hayes, a low-ranking soldier with no formal leadership role, but with a strong instinct for survival, and instead of succumbing to hunger and thirst, Hayes and his men searched every inch of that island for resources. By sheer luck, they found what Cornelisz didn't have: fresh water. A small hidden spring trickled from the rocks, just enough to keep them alive. They hunted seabirds and scavenged shellfish, sustaining themselves while those under Cornelisz's rule were slowly starving. Beacon Island, where Cornelisz ruled, was a prison of death, and Hayes' island was a refuge of survival. Time moved forward. Word of these men's endurance actually reached Cornelisz, and he realized these guys were a serious threat. If they could last long enough, they would start to challenge his rule and likely hold him accountable for all of the horrors he's committed. And that couldn't be allowed. Cornelisz sent a group of his men to wipe them out. Armed with weapons and fueled by the belief that their leader was untouchable, they crossed the water to slaughter the soldiers. But Hayes and his men were ready. They had spent weeks fortifying their island, using driftwood and rocks to build crude barriers. They crafted weapons from whatever they could find: clubs, sharpened stakes, and even slingshots. When Cornelisz's men landed, they didn't find helpless, starving soldiers. They found warriors prepared to fight. It was a trap. Cornelisz's men were overpowered. Some were killed and others captured. In the chaos of the battle, Hayes and his men were actually able to capture Cornelisz, finally removing him from power. And from that point on, they were focused again on reuniting with the other survivors and everyone's survival. Hayes and his men did the only thing they could do. They sent desperate signals for help. They lit fires, waved makeshift flags, and scanned the horizon for sails. For months, the survivors on Beacon Island watched the horizon, hoping for rescue. 4 months they had endured the cruelty of a psychotic leader in Cornelisz. There are stories, besides the horrific murders, of him assaulting women, literally killing families, luring men away from their wife and children so that the women could be assaulted and the children killed. It was just like this guy, and I think even the accounts that come up historically about this guy is that he wasn't just like a guy that went too far with survival. He actually went like full-blown psychotic and had a pure and like almost lustful thirst of blood. And he was killing everybody, and he wasn't just killing, he was torturing people. And he wasn't killing them in nice ways. Like this guy just fucking sucked. He sucked in every, I guess, literal version of the word. For months, these poor people had to endure this bastard. And now, with Cornelisz captured, all they had to do was focus on their survival and wait. And that's when sails finally appeared on the horizon. Pelsaert had returned. This commander arrived with a fully armed Dutch East India Company vessel, expecting to find survivors, waiting desperately for relief. Instead, he found an absolute bloodbath. Immediately, the truth spilled out. The moment the ship anchored, the remaining survivors rushed to tell him what Cornelisz had done. They spoke of mass execution, betrayals, and the bodies left to rot on the sand. Cornelisz, who had spent months playing God, was now powerless. The soldier, Wiebbe Hayes, personally led Pelsaert to the bodies, evidence of the atrocity that had taken place. The Dutch East India Company did not believe in trials for traitors. Justice was swift, and on that very same island where Cornelisz and his men had butchered the innocent, executions began. Some were hanged, others were drowned, bound, and thrown into the sea. Cornelisz himself was kept alive just long enough to face judgment. His hands were severed before he was finally executed, a warning to anyone who wants to follow in his footsteps. For the survivors, the nightmare was over. They had been rescued, but they would never escape the horrors of what they had witnessed. Even after they had sailed away from the islands, the ghosts would follow them forever. The story of the Batavia would actually kind of sit dormant for centuries, until the wreck of the Batavia was uncovered by archaeologists. But the ship itself isn't the only thing left behind. On the islands where the survivors fought, archaeologists still uncover chilling remnants, human bones, some with their hands bound, rusted blades buried in the sand, evidence of makeshift fortifications where Wiebbe Hayes and his men made their last stand. The sea may have took the ship, but the island refused to forget. The Dutch East India Company, despite its reputation for ruthless discipline, was deeply embarrassed by what had happened. A ship of their fleet, their symbol of wealth and power, had descended into savagery. Rather than allow the full details to spread, the company tried to rewrite the story. They framed Cornelisz as a lone madman downplaying the wider collapse of order. There was another side to this reaction. Many people in the Dutch Republic saw Wiebbe Hayes as a hero, a man who had resisted tyranny and fought against impossible odds. His leadership saved lives and proved that not everyone abandoned morality in the face of survival. Yet in modern times, the story is not so simple. Among the many discoveries of the island was one in particular. The skeleton we mentioned at the start, buried in the sand with his hand bound. This significant yet mysterious discovery remains a mystery because the identity of the victim is unknown. It's unknown whether he was part of Cornelius's soldiers, maybe someone that tried to rise up against him, or perhaps just another victim of Cornelisz. And it gets me thinking, how many more unidentified victims of his are still out there on those islands or buried just off the coast of Australia? We may never know the truth, but as long as the bones remain, now the Batavia may be long gone, but its ghost will still whisper from beneath the waves. Thanks again for joining in, and if you liked this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel or give us a like. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys again next week.